A millionaire CEO gets into his car and suddenly hears a young cleaning lady whisper to him, "Don't say a word." Her confession shook him to the core. The people closest to him were plotting a betrayal that could cost him everything. What happened next changed his life forever. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments which country or city you're watching from. It's very important for us to know. The office tower had begun to empty long before midnight, yet the upper floors still glowed faintly with the last scattered lamps of executives too proud or too anxious to leave their work undone. The building had its own heartbeat after hours, the sigh of the air conditioning, the muted hum of elevators resting in their shafts, and the faint clicking of a security guard's shoes on the marble lobby floor every half hour. Above the private office of Andrew, founder and chief executive of a company that bore his name, was lit like a solitary beacon against the city skyline. He sat behind a desk piled high with documents, his eyes tracing words without absorbing them, his mind turning instead toward the meeting scheduled for the next day. The foreign investors were due to arrive just after noon. Years of work, years of negotiations, and slow-building trust would come to a climax. His thoughts pulsed with a mixture of pride and weariness. He had walked this road for so long and carried so much of it on his shoulders that he hardly remembered what it felt like to lean on someone else. Far below his office in the quiet garage, another figure moved with much less ceremony. Maria was 28, slender and sturdy at once, dressed in the navy uniform of the night cleaning staff. She carried a bucket in one hand and a sponge in the other, her dark hair tied back beneath a plain scarf. Her routine was one she could perform half asleep, emptying trash bins, wiping down desks that had been covered with coffee stains, vacuuming the corridors where only her footsteps could be heard. She had learned to love the silence because silence meant nobody staring through her, nobody laughing at her accent, nobody asking her why she had taken a job far beneath the education she once dreamed of. She reminded herself each night that the wages, modest though they were, paid her sister's tuition and bought her mother's medicine. Those two women, depending on her at home, gave every bucket she carried and every mop she wrung a kind of dignity. Tonight she moved more slowly, lingering in the underground garage where the cars of the senior executives gleamed under fluorescent lights. Andrew's sleek black sedan sat in the first row, its surface reflecting the dull white bulbs like a mirror of water. Maria crouched beside it, dipping her sponge into a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing away the faint lines of city dust. She knew this car well. Among the cleaning staff, it was whispered to belong to the boss himself, the man who had built the company brick by brick from nothing. She had never spoken to him, only glimpsed him in the elevator once or twice, always with others around, always carrying an air of gravity that made him seem unapproachable. Still, she took extra care with the car, not out of hope for a tip, but from some instinct to show respect. The sound of footsteps broke the steady rhythm of her scrubbing. At first she thought it was the security guard, but the steps were lighter, quicker, and accompanied by laughter that carried easily in the concrete space. Maria froze, crouching lower behind the sedan, her sponge dripping water onto the floor. The heavy garage door had not opened. Whoever had come down must have used the private stairwell. Two figures appeared between the rows of cars. Richard, Andrew's longtime partner, his suit jacket loosened, his tie pulled halfway from its knot, and Evelyn, Andrew's executive assistant, whose immaculate hair gleamed under the lights. They walked close together, their voices lowered but not enough to conceal the tone of amusement that colored every word. Maria pressed her back against the cool metal of the car, holding her breath. She had no right to be eavesdropping, she told herself. Yet she also knew that to reveal herself now would draw their anger. Richard's voice rang clearly in the still air. Tomorrow will be simple. He'll walk in, see the papers, and sign like he always does. The man can't help himself. 15 years and he still trusts me like a brother. Evelyn laughed, a sharp, almost cruel sound. A blind brother, more like it. He'll have no idea he's giving everything away until it's too late. By the day after tomorrow, Andrew will be looking for another office to sit in. Maybe we'll let him keep a chair as a souvenir. Maria's hand tightened on the sponge until soapy water ran between her fingers. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. These were not jokes. The contempt was too real. the certainty too chilling. Richard stopped beside the very car Maria was cleaning. He leaned one elbow against the hood, so close she could smell the tobacco clinging to his shirt. The beauty is he won't even question it. He'll see the highlighted tabs you prepared, he'll smile, and he'll put his name down. And just like that, Harper Company will be ours to do with as we please. Evelyn lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but in the empty garage, every syllable reached Maria's ears. It's almost sad, isn't it? All those years building this empire, and tomorrow he'll hand it to us like a trusting dog dropping a bone at its master's feet. They both laughed again, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. For Maria, time seemed to stop. The suds on the car slid down slowly in irregular streaks, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to move, to step out, to shout that she had heard them. But fear gripped her. She was only a cleaner. Who would believe her against two people in fine suits with perfect smiles? She imagined being fired on the spot, accused of lying, her family left without support. The thought made her stomach twist. Richard and Evelyn eventually turned back toward the stairwell, their voices fading as they spoke of dinner reservations and champagne. Their footsteps disappeared into silence. Only then did Maria exhale, her body trembling from the tension of remaining still. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the sedan's door, feeling her heart pound. On the long walk home, the city streets almost empty, she could not shake the words from her mind. She thought of Andrew, the man she had only seen from afar, the man who tomorrow would sign away everything he had built. She thought of her own father, who once ran a small workshop with pride until a trusted partner cheated him out of it. She had been a child, powerless to help, and she had watched him sink into bitterness until illness carried him away. Nobody had warned him. Nobody had spoken. That silence had destroyed him. Maria stopped on the sidewalk under a flickering street lamp, her bucket swinging heavily at her side. She understood what tomorrow meant. She could keep silent and remain safe, or she could speak and risk everything. Fear battled with conscience inside her chest. She imagined her mother's weary face, her sister's hopeful smile when she received each month's tuition. If she lost her job, what would become of them? And yet the memory of Richard's laughter, Evelyn's scornful voice, burned in her ears. By the time she reached her small apartment, dawn was already graying the edges of the sky. She set down her bucket and leaned against the door, exhausted, but her mind had already chosen. She could not repeat the silence of her father's tragedy. Whatever the cost, tomorrow she would find Andrew and tell him the truth. Even if he dismissed her, even if she paid with her job, she would not carry the burden of watching another man lose everything because no one had dared to warn him. That night, in the silence of the city and the emptiness of her modest room, Maria lay awake with the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. Above her, in a high-rise office still glowing faintly with midnight light, Andrew worked on papers he believed would secure his company's future. Neither of them yet knew that their paths were set to collide in a way that would change both their lives forever. Morning crept over the city with a pale, reluctant light, painting the towers and rooftops in muted shades of silver. Andrew sat at his dining table, a cup of coffee cooling untouched beside him, his gaze fixed on a stack of papers he had brought home the night before. He had not slept well, if at all. The meeting with the foreign investors occupied his mind with such intensity that even the quietest hours had offered no rest. Every detail had been rehearsed, every line of the presentation memorized, and yet beneath the polished surface of preparation, a persistent unease nagged at him. He told himself it was nothing more than the ordinary anxiety of a man facing the culmination of years of labor. Still, as the first light touched the rim of his coffee cup, he felt a hollow in his chest that no amount of determination could fill. Downstairs in the same building, Maria stood outside the private office suite, her mop bucket abandoned in the corridor, her hands twisting the cloth of her cleaning rag. She had not intended to come so early, but her decision the night before had given her neither peace nor sleep. She had risen before dawn, her body trembling with the weight of what she was about to do. The silence of her apartment had been suffocating, every shadow reminding her of her father's weary face, of the lesson she had sworn to carry. When you see someone being cheated and you can speak, you must speak. Now standing at the threshold of the office of the most powerful man she had ever seen, she felt her courage slipping like sand through her fingers. Inside, Andrew sat in the quiet, scanning through a briefing folder prepared by Evelyn, filled with notes in her neat, precise handwriting. He found comfort in the orderliness of her annotations, the way she anticipated his questions before he asked them. He had known Evelyn for years, trusted her judgment more than most of his executives. And Richard, his partner in building the company, Andrew had always believed their bond was stronger than any contract. Still, that uneasy feeling gnawed at him, sharpening as he heard the tentative knock at his door. When he looked up, he saw Maria hovering in the doorway, her uniform slightly damp from morning cleaning, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. At first, he barely recognized her. She was simply one of the faces that drifted at the edges of his vision in the office corridors. Someone who polished what others left behind. He frowned slightly, wondering what urgent matter could have brought her here. "Yes?" His voice was measured, polite but distracted, as he gestured for her to come in. Maria stepped forward, her throat dry, her fingers clenched around the rag she still held. She searched for words, but they tangled in her mouth. Andrew's eyes, steady and expectant, made her feel small and clumsy, as though her entire presence here were a mistake. She swallowed, then spoke with effort. "Sir, I have something important to tell you. I don't know if you'll believe me, but I have to say it. Last night, in the garage, I was cleaning your car and—" She faltered, watching his expression grow cautious, even skeptical. "I heard them, Richard and Evelyn. They didn't see me. They were talking about you, about tomorrow." Andrew's brows drew together. He set down his papers and leaned back slowly in his chair. "You heard what exactly?" Maria forced herself to recall every word, every mocking phrase. She described Richard leaning against the car, Evelyn's laugh cutting through the air, their talk of documents prepared for his signature, their cruel prediction that by the day after tomorrow he would be left with nothing. She repeated their words as best she could, her voice trembling but clear. For a moment, Andrew said nothing. He simply watched her, his eyes narrowing, his features caught between disbelief and irritation. "Do you realize what you are suggesting?" he asked finally, his tone quiet but sharp. "These are people I have trusted for years. Evelyn organizes my life. Richard has been with me since the beginning. To accuse them of this kind of treachery—" Maria felt heat rising in her face, but she pressed on. "I know what I heard. They didn't even try to hide it. They laughed about you, about how easy it would be. They said you'd sign anything they gave you, that you were blind." She stopped herself, biting back the harsher words she had overheard, words that had stung even her, though she was only a witness. "I couldn't stay quiet, not after what they said." Andrew rose slowly from his chair, turning his back to her as he walked to the window. The city sprawled out before him, a mosaic of glass and steel, a kingdom he had built from long nights and impossible decisions. He wanted to dismiss her words, to treat them as the nervous imaginings of a tired young woman who had mistaken a harmless conversation for conspiracy. And yet, fragments of memory surfaced unbidden. Richard's sudden secretive meetings, Evelyn's insistence on handling the contracts herself, financial reports that had seemed too smooth, too polished, small things easily explained away at the time. But now, when set beside Maria's account, they took on a darker shape. He turned back to her, his voice softer now. "Why tell me this? You could have walked away and kept your job safe. No one would have known." Maria's hands tightened on the rag until her knuckles turned white. "Because I've seen what silence does. My father lost everything because nobody warned him when they could have. I couldn't watch it happen again. Even if you don't believe me, at least I've said what I know. At least I've done something." The room fell into silence. Andrew studied her, seeing not just the uniform but the fire trembling behind her eyes. She had nothing to gain, everything to lose, and still she had come. Slowly, reluctantly, something inside him shifted. He saw the truth of her words in her fear and in her courage. "Sit down," he said quietly, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Tell me again, every detail." Maria obeyed, repeating each moment with painstaking care. She described the way Richard had tapped his pen against the car's hood, the precise phrases Evelyn had used, even the perfume she had worn that lingered in the stale air of the garage. As she spoke, Andrew felt the unease harden into something colder, heavier. These were not wild inventions. They were details only someone who had truly been there could recall. When she finished, her voice faded into silence, and Andrew leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled beneath his chin. He remained there for a long moment, weighing everything. The years of loyalty against the possibility of betrayal, the risk of dismissing her against the greater risk of believing her. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you, Maria. You've done more than you realize. I don't know yet what to make of it, but you've given me reason to look closer, and that may have saved me." She lowered her eyes, a faint relief crossing her face. "I was afraid you'd think I was lying." Andrew shook his head slowly. "You've given me too much detail for that, but I need to be certain. If what you say is true, I cannot confront them outright. I'll need proof, and I'll need a plan." Maria rose, clutching her rag as though it were a shield. "I'll help however I can, but if they find out I spoke—" "They won't," Andrew interrupted firmly. "I'll see to it." He paused, then added with a touch of something like respect, "You've shown more courage this morning than most people in this building have shown in years." When she left his office, Andrew remained at his desk, staring at the untouched coffee, now cold. He thought of Richard's easy smile, Evelyn's reassuring words, and the possibility that every gesture of loyalty had been a mask. Maria's voice echoed in his ears. "They laughed about how blind you are." That laughter would not leave his mind. It rang louder than the silence of his office, louder than the hum of the city outside. And as he sat alone in the quiet, Andrew made a decision. Tomorrow he would walk into the meeting as they expected, calm and trusting. But this time, he would not be the blind man they imagined. He would be watching. He would be ready. The day that had begun with doubt ended with resolve. Maria's courage had planted a seed of suspicion, and now Andrew knew what he had to do. The morning of the meeting dawned with an unsettling clarity, as if the sky itself sensed the tension of the day to come. Andrew rose earlier than usual, his thoughts already circling the plan he had devised in the restless hours of the night. The conversation with Maria lingered in his mind, every phrase she had repeated still echoing. He had not told her the entire truth, that once she left his office, he had immediately summoned a trusted attorney, a man who had worked quietly in the background for years. Together, through the dark hours before dawn, they pieced together a strategy that would expose betrayal without warning those who plotted it. Andrew had been in business long enough to understand one fundamental rule. The most dangerous enemy is the one who still believes you are his friend. By mid-morning, the building was alive with the usual bustle of staff. But Andrew felt removed from the rhythm. He walked through the hallways with a steady, practiced smile, acknowledging greetings, nodding to employees who had no idea of the storm gathering just beyond their sight. His mind was already in the conference room, rehearsing the part he must play. He had to be convincing. If Richard or Evelyn saw the smallest crack in his demeanor, the plan could collapse before it began. He reminded himself of Maria's courage, of how she had risked her position to bring him the truth. He owed it to her and to himself not to falter now. When the hour approached, Andrew straightened his tie and entered the glass-walled conference room that had seen so many victories in the company's history. The long, polished table gleamed under the bright lights, set with crystal glasses and neatly arranged documents. Richard was already there, rising with a wide grin that seemed too easy, too rehearsed. He embraced Andrew like a brother, his voice booming with warmth. Evelyn followed close behind, holding a leather folder pressed to her chest, her smile practiced in its gentleness. They looked exactly as they always had, confidants and allies, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Andrew felt the old habit of trust tug at him. Then Maria's words returned like a blade against his chest. "They laughed about how blind you are." "Everything is ready," Richard said, clapping Andrew on the shoulder. "The investors will be here soon, and all we need is your signature. Smooth sailing from here." Evelyn slid the folder across the table, her tone calm, reassuring, almost maternal. "I've marked the pages for you, Andrew, just as always. Yellow tabs, clear instructions. You don't need to trouble yourself with the details. We've prepared everything with the utmost care. Andrew sat, his expression composed, his hand resting on the pen they had placed before him. For a moment he stared at the documents, the weight of years pressing against his chest. These were the people who had shared his triumphs and his struggles, who had toasted victories and endured losses at his side. To imagine that all of it had been a prelude to betrayal felt almost unbearable, and yet the evidence was clear. Their confidence, their certainty, betrayed them as surely as their whispered words in the garage. He reached for the pen, his fingers closing around it as Richard and Evelyn exchanged a satisfied glance. Their victory seemed so close they could taste it. The trap was about to spring, but not in the way they imagined. Andrew set the pen down deliberately and leaned back in his chair. His voice was calm, almost casual, but every word carried a weight that made Richard's smile falter. Before I sign anything, I'd like to show you something. The door to the conference room opened. Andrew's attorney entered, carrying a stack of files, followed by two witnesses from the board who had been discreetly informed of what was about to unfold. The room's atmosphere shifted instantly, the air heavy with tension. Richard blinked, trying to recover his composure. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder, though her smile remained fixed in place. "What's this about?" Richard asked, forcing a laugh. "A surprise party?" Andrew's eyes were steady, his voice sharper now. "A surprise, yes, but not for me." He gestured to the attorney, who placed the files on the table and opened them with meticulous care. Pages of financial records, transaction histories, and photographs spread before them, damning in their detail. "I've spent the last hours reviewing discrepancies in our accounts," Andrew continued, his tone even but laced with iron. "And thanks to testimony I received last night, I now understand what those discrepancies mean. These documents," he tapped the stack with a deliberate finger, "prove the existence of shell companies, falsified contracts, and unauthorized transfers. They reveal a pattern of fraud and conspiracy that has been carried out under my nose for far too long." Evelyn's smile wavered, her knuckles white against the folder she clutched. "Andrew, this is absurd. These are complicated matters. You're misinterpreting the data." But Richard's mask slipped more quickly. His voice rose with anger, his face flushing red. "Where did you get this? Who fed you this garbage? This is private company business." Andrew's calm did not falter. "Private business that you manipulated for your own gain. And as for who informed me," he allowed himself the faintest smile, "let's just say you underestimated someone you thought invisible. You both did." For a moment silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the lights above. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Evelyn. She lowered her gaze, her composure cracking as she realized the gravity of their situation. "You thought I was blind," Andrew said softly, leaning forward, his voice carrying more weight than any raised shout could. "You thought I would sign without question, just as you planned. But you forgot the one truth about building a company like this. I built it by seeing what others overlooked, and this time I saw you." The attorney continued laying out evidence, emails copied, transfers traced, meetings recorded. Each piece built upon the last until the web was undeniable. Richard tried to interrupt, his words blustering and furious, but every outburst only deepened his guilt. Evelyn attempted to maintain her composure, offering half-hearted explanations, but her trembling hands betrayed her. The trap had closed. The faces Andrew had once trusted now appeared desperate and cornered, stripped of the power they had wielded with such confidence. The very arrogance that had led them to mock him in the garage had now blinded them to the danger they themselves had courted. At last Andrew rose from his seat, gathering the papers into a neat stack. His eyes swept over Richard and Evelyn, not with rage, but with something colder, a quiet finality. "This company will not fall to betrayal, not from outsiders, and certainly not from within. Whatever happens next, you brought it upon yourselves." As he left the conference room, the board witnesses following close behind, the echo of his footsteps rang with the certainty of a man who had reclaimed control. Behind him, Richard's voice rose in impotent fury, Evelyn's softer tones breaking into frantic protest. But Andrew did not look back. The trap had been sprung, and there would be no escape for those who had underestimated him. The corridor outside was bright with the midday sun streaming through tall windows, but Andrew felt a deeper illumination within himself. He thought of Maria, of the courage it had taken for her to speak, and he knew that without her voice, he might even now be shackled by trust turned to ruin. The battle was not yet over, but the balance had shifted. He would see this through. For the company he had built, for the truth, and for the simple honesty of a young woman who had refused to remain silent. When Andrew stepped out of the conference room, leaving behind the scattered documents, the raised voices, and the shattered masks of Richard and Evelyn, it was as though the building itself exhaled. The tension that had hung heavy for weeks without his realizing seemed suddenly to lift, replaced by a clarity sharper than the sun streaming through the high glass windows. The footsteps of the board witnesses echoed in the corridor behind him, and his attorney carried the files like a weapon freshly unsheathed. Andrew himself felt neither triumph nor anger, but an unexpected calm, as if the storm had finally passed and left him standing in the open air. The consequences of what had just occurred unfolded swiftly. Calls were made, authorities alerted, and by the end of the day, Richard and Evelyn were escorted out of the building, their defiance replaced with pale disbelief. The investors, wary of scandal, postponed their meeting indefinitely, but Andrew found he did not care. For the first time in years, he was not consumed by the hunger to close a deal. Instead, he was consumed by the memory of a young woman in a cleaner's uniform, clutching a rag in trembling hands, yet speaking with a courage that had shifted the entire course of events. Later that evening, when the building was quiet again and the employees had gone home, Andrew found Maria still at work, dutifully pushing her cart down the corridor, her head lowered, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. She looked so small against the vastness of the polished marble halls, and yet he knew she had carried more weight on her shoulders that day than many of his executives ever had. "Maria," he called gently, and she froze, turning with wide eyes that betrayed both fear and uncertainty. "Sir?" she whispered, as though bracing herself for reprimand. He stepped closer, his expression softening. "It's over. They're gone. What you told me. It saved everything." Relief washed over her face, mingled with disbelief. "You believed me?" "I didn't just believe you," he said, his voice low with sincerity. "I trusted you, and I was right to. You've done more for this company in a single act of honesty than some have done in years of service." Her hands twisted nervously in the cloth of her apron. "I only did what anyone should do." Andrew shook his head slowly. "No, Maria. Most people would have stayed silent. You didn't. That makes you different. That makes you brave." For a long moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. Then Andrew continued, his tone more formal now, though no less warm. "I don't want you cleaning offices anymore. Not unless you choose to. From now on, you'll have a new role here. We'll find you training, education, whatever you need. You've earned a place in this company beyond the shadows." Her eyes widened, glistening with tears she tried to hold back. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I never expected—" "You don't need to say anything," Andrew interrupted gently. "Just know that your courage won't be forgotten." The days that followed brought a whirlwind of consequences. Authorities sifted through the mountain of evidence Andrew and his attorney had presented. Richard and Evelyn faced formal charges, their names dragged through headlines that once praised their achievements. Employees whispered in astonishment, some expressing anger at the betrayal, others relief that justice had been done. Investors who had once doubted Andrew's leadership now admired his resolve, calling to express renewed interest in partnerships built on honesty rather than deception. The company, though shaken, began to steady itself, and for the first time in a long while, Andrew felt certain that it stood on ground both firmer and cleaner than before. Maria, too, found her life altered in ways she had never imagined. True to his word, Andrew arranged for her to receive education and training, guiding her into a new department where her sharp memory and keen sense of detail quickly distinguished her. At first she felt out of place, a cleaner among professionals, but Andrew's quiet encouragement, in the respect she earned from others, soon gave her confidence. She discovered that the same attentiveness that once served her in silence now served her in strategy, in analysis, in problem solving. The girl who had bent over a mop in the shadows now sat at a desk where her voice mattered. Andrew watched her progress with pride, not as a benefactor proud of his charity, but as a man humbled by the knowledge that he had nearly lost everything, if not for her courage. He began to see more clearly than ever the silent power that existed among those overlooked, the janitors, the receptionists, the clerks, people whose voices often went unheard, yet whose eyes and ears absorbed more truth than any report or executive summary could capture. He realized that trust should not be confined to polished boardrooms, but extended to those who lived in the quiet spaces in between. It was from this realization that a new idea took root. Andrew began drafting a program within the company, one that would protect and empower employees at every level to speak out against wrongdoing, to share concerns without fear of retribution. He called it simply The Voice, because it was meant for those who had too often gone unheard. Maria was among the first to be invited into the committee that shaped it, her experience becoming both guide and symbol. For her, it was humbling, almost surreal, but Andrew insisted, "You've seen what silence does. Now help us make sure silence never harms this company again." Months passed and the changes took hold. The company grew not just in profit but in integrity, its reputation rising higher as news spread of its new culture of openness. Employees spoke with renewed loyalty, investors took confidence in the transparency, and Andrew himself felt a peace he had not known in years. He had endured betrayal, but from it had sprung a new foundation, one built not on blind trust but on tested truth. Richard and Evelyn, meanwhile, faded into the obscurity of courtrooms and headlines, their names tarnished beyond repair. There was no satisfaction in their downfall for Andrew, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice had been served. He no longer wasted thought on them. His energy was devoted to what came next, to building not only a stronger company, but a more human one. One evening, nearly a year after that fateful night in the garage, Andrew stood once more at the window of his office watching the city lights glitter across the horizon. Behind him, Maria entered, no longer in a cleaner's uniform, but in the attire of her new role, her hair neatly tied, her face glowing with confidence. She carried a folder of proposals for the scholarship fund she had been tasked to oversee, a fund designed to support the education of children from struggling families, a vision she had suggested herself. "Good evening, sir," she said softly, though the timidity of old was gone from her voice. Andrew turned, smiling warmly. "Maria, come in. Or should I say, Director Maria?" She laughed, shaking her head. "It still feels strange to hear it." "Perhaps," he replied, "but it feels right." He took the folder from her hands, glancing at the numbers inside, then looking back at her. "Do you remember what you told me that morning? That you couldn't stay silent, not after what you'd seen happen to your father? That choice changed everything, not only for me, but for this company, and now for countless others who will be given opportunities because of you." Maria lowered her gaze, her voice quiet with emotion. "I only did what I thought was right. And that," Andrew said firmly, "is what makes you extraordinary." They stood together in the soft glow of the office, the weight of the past year behind them, the promise of many years ahead. Outside, the city pulsed with its endless rhythm, indifferent to the story that had unfolded within these walls. But for Andrew and Maria, the meaning was clear. Trust once broken could be rebuilt, not by clinging to the old, but by forging something new with those who had proven their loyalty in the hardest of ways. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had, in the end, given him more than he could have imagined. It had given him clarity. It had given him a true ally. And above all, it had given him a reason to believe once more that from even the humblest voices, greatness could rise. And so the company stood not weakened but stronger, its foundation not shaken but renewed. Because sometimes, Andrew reflected, salvation does not come from the boardroom or the polished words of partners. Sometimes salvation comes from the quiet courage of a young woman with a rag in her hands who dared to speak when silence might have been easier. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more inspiring tales and share this one with your friends. Because some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.